Good morning and welcome to Mrs. T. Fox Resources on YouTube. Today, we are talking about portraiture. Specifically, we're talking about drawing the mouth. Specifically, we're talking about drawing a smile. So the way I teach portraiture is on a very strict scaffolded approach. Students begin with drawing eyes, then they draw noses, then they draw mouths, then they draw hair, and then we move on to what we call the expressive self-portrait. Link to that project is in the video description below. For all the features practice, students use the number 2 pencil only. When we move on to the expressive self-portrait, then I add in a 4B pencil for the really, really dark values. All supplies used in the making of this video can be found in the video description, which is directly below the video. So without further ado, let's get started. And when I went to start doing my contour line drawing, I noticed that I had the same square that I had last week, which was much more square-like, and this is much more rectangular-like. This is really important if you've never taught on a grid before. Make sure that the proportion and the relationship of the square the kids are using, or the space, is the same proportion as the reference photo. Because what's going to happen is if this is a really long skinny rectangle and this is a square, the eye's not going to fit, and it's going to get skewed. So that was something I kind of learned along the way back in the beginning. And I know it really does sound like common sense, but it obviously wasn't to me because I screwed it up. So, all right, let's start drawing. This is a very light grid that I printed on here because, like I said last week, nothing annoys me more than when I have the kids draw something cool and they're using the little printed grid, but the grid is so dark and black that it drowns out their drawing. So I just made it super light gray. So that's the reason for that. As we're talking to kids about scaling things up and keeping things in proportion and using something like a quadrant, and there is nothing wrong with this. I mean, you know, like, is somebody going to tell Chuck Close, God rest his soul, that his grid method didn't work? Because I'm pretty sure it did. So when they get in here and they're considering the relationship, because drawing is about relationships, especially when you're working with the human mouth and we're working with teeth, we don't want people's teeth, number one, to look like a bunch of rectangles. We don't want them to look fake with the big dark lines in between, and we don't want them all to be the same size. So how do we get kids to see that, you know, teeth are progressively get smaller as they go back around? You know, we're talking about, you're getting into some serious anatomy here, but when I was teaching high school, I used to tell the kids, your teeth are like a can of tuna, and that can of tuna is inside your face. And so when the tuna can disappears around here, the teeth get darker because the light can't get in. And for whatever reason, the whole tuna can thing seemed to really resonate with them. And they were like, oh, okay, we get it, because they weren't adding any value to the teeth on the sides. They were only, you know, they were just leaving everything totally white. And the people looked like, you know, they had a mouthful of chiclets. So as they're laying it out, make sure that they they consider things like how much of this tooth is above the horizontal line and how much is below, how much is to the right, how much is to the left. Like these teeth fall right on the crosshair. So I was able to use that crosshair to figure out where everything needed to go. And I had to erase and redo several times because my teeth were the wrong size. I think I had this one way too small at one point. So those are just some things. You can also have kids cite. When my guys do their line drawing at the very beginning, because my whole curriculum is scaffolded. So in the very, very beginning, they're doing a line drawing on a quadrant so they can understand how to use a quadrant and how to line things up. So we call it striking a visual plumb line and looking at where this lines up with this, lines up with this, how wide things are. Those are all things that they can use to figure out how to lay their mouth out in their portrait and how to do their practice. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about getting the shape of the teeth correct to begin with, because that's very much a negative space issue, which is also, again, something that they've just come off of. They've come off of a big negative space unit before they do value, and value leads to this self-portrait. So these little areas in here around the teeth, the negative space, like I'm seeing already now that I'm looking at the negative space, that this needs to be more round. But if they have a solid contour line drawing and then they come back in with these little tweaks, it's going to be really, really easy for them to tweak because they have everything in the right place, about 90% in the right place. I like to stress that everybody is an individual and teeth are no exception. I always have them look at their neighbor's teeth. You know, everybody's teeth are shaped differently. Some people have large teeth, some people, I have very small teeth. And I just think it's fascinating when we start drawing people, especially when you're doing commission work for people, which I did prior to teaching and still do a little bit on the side. If somebody's teeth are not correct, it doesn't look like the person. So I'm always stressing to them, you know, this is not a place where you can check out and just have generic looking teeth because it won't look like you. So I'm just working on this black shape where the light is not getting in. It's a lot about edges. Teeth are translucent. So you can see there's a tiny little value right here in this tooth. So let's go ahead and put that in. You will notice that I'm going to jump around a lot because what happens is when I'm working in a certain area, I'll see something. I'm like, oh, I have to tell them about that. Oh, I have to tell them about that. And the reason for the value scale is so they can put this up next to it. And, you know, if they've got this super, super, super dark, I just will say, well, slide that next to your value scale and tell me how dark that should be. It should only be that dark. And they're like, oh, okay, Fox, I got it. Or even down here where they have this little light value, it's down here. So they can just match it, which makes it super, super easy because it's right here on the worksheet. I try to imagine how can I make this easy for them and how can I make it easy for you as the instructor? If you don't have to print separate value scales, and now this tooth is starting to come around the side of the tuna can, and so is this one. I can't really see the edge of this tooth. It's kind of blurred. So I'm going to blur it out because everything is disappearing back here in the mouth. If you don't see it, don't draw it. Because when you start cooking it up, if you're drawing a realistic portrait, now everything I'm saying is in the context of drawing a realistic portrait. If you start cooking stuff up, it's not going to look like the person. And it's certainly, if it's you, it's certainly not going to look like you. And it won't look real because we're always about talking to our viewer, visual communication without using words. So what you should be saying loud and clear to whoever sees your portrait is this is a portrait of Tiffany or of Kathy or of Lori. Nothing made the kids happier than when we would hang the portraits in the commons and their teachers would say, hey, I saw your portrait in the commons. Because that, my friends, is a victory. If they've drawn a portrait of themselves and everybody knows it's them, yeah. Then you're moving on to colored pencil after this unit, and they are fired up and ready to rock and roll. It's all about building that confidence. I'm also always telling everybody that they need to ask themselves, which value is darker? Is this value darker or this value darker? Because what happens as they start to add value is everything kind of gets gray. We've all been there. And that's where that comparison contrast comes in to say, okay, well, let's evaluate the feature, in this case, the mouth. And let's find out, let's just ask ourselves a couple simple questions. Is this darker than this? So we're constantly using a comparison, because what they're going to want to do is either make everything the same shade, or they're only going to stay in these values right here. We want them to use the whole value scale, all the values. And that goes for when you're painting, that goes for color. So as I add value, what I usually have them do is stay on the point of the pencil, not on the side of the pencil. There's not enough control there on the side of the pencil. So I have them stay on the point. When we do our value lesson before this, they learn how to move the values and shade to get the values, the edges that they need, because then when they move into the portrait, they know how much pressure, they know about edges. Like here's a soft transition right here coming out from the really, really dark area. And then we're coming out onto the lip. That's not a hard edge right there. That's a soft edge. You don't want really dark lines between the teeth. That's another mistake that kids will make. And it's not their fault. It's just nobody ever told them. I remember when I learned to draw portraits and my instructor was like, oh, well, do you have black lines between your teeth? And I was like, no. And she's like, oh, well, why are you drawing them? And I was like, oh, okay. And it was just me not observing. Remember, drawing is about observation. There's a lot of information that they have to take in. And we did a lot of those kinds of things when we did the shoes and when we did the spheres. So we went ahead and knocked all of that out. And I always would say to them, it's a very logical progression. Doesn't matter what you're drawing. We're going to take all of those things that we learned and we're going to apply them. Now, when they erase, just have them be really careful, because they are abrading the paper when they erase. And when you abrade the paper, that means you're taking a layer off. It's a lot harder to reapply the graphite. So instead of drawing like a hard outline for the top of the lip, I'll have them kind of mold the value, figure out where they think the top of the lip should be, and just work. See, because there's a soft edge there too. And with graphite, you really want them to keep their hand out of it, because it can get really smudgy. We don't do blending stumps. I had somebody ask me that last week, and it's not that I'm like anti-blending stump. It's just if you give kids something like a blending stump, beginners, I'm talking about beginners, they'll just lean on it and just grind the heck out of the value instead of really learning to manipulate the pencil and work the value. Later on, when they get to be a little more advanced and they have their skill set and they're confident, if they want to go try the blending stump out, go for it. And, like I said, I'm not anti-blending stump. I just like them to learn to use the pencil in the beginning before we get into things like extra tools. I like to keep the practice small so they can get a win. They can feel confident. It's all about that confidence. You have confident kids, you can throw anything at them and they'll be like, okay, whatever, let's do it. And that's what you want. Because, everybody hates that pushback. You tell them you're going to do something and it's the moaning and the groaning. Did find when I was in the classroom that they lots of times weren't so much moaning and groaning because it was what we were doing. I think they just like to moan and groan. In fact, one day I had a kid who's like, Miss Fox, we just like to bitch. And I was like, oh, because I was starting to get all offended, like they didn't like what I had them doing. This was years ago. And they were like, nah, we just like to complain, to hear ourselves complain. That was a little revolutionary for me. I was taking it a little personal. You want them to avoid things like putting those really hard lines in. Sometimes we get a little line happy when it comes to skin, mouths, teeth, eyes, eyelashes. We were talking last week about caterpillars crawling across your face for your eyebrows. if you don't see it, don't draw it. They enjoy drawing the mouths. That's the eyes and the mouth are the favorites. The tutorials, when we did them in class, we would watch them together. All the tutorials that are in my portrait curriculum, we just watched them as a class, like as we did each feature. I answered any questions they had, and then they got to it. Really worked out nice. If they needed a refresh, they just would dial up that video again. And teachers tell me that does really seem to help. When it comes to strokes, I don't really stress too much. I like them to either meander in the beginning back and forth like this, or do little circles, just because, especially if you're working with middle schoolers, they're so heavy-handed. If they try to master the hatching and the cross hatching for laying value in with graphite, it's very, very difficult for them to get it smooth, which is why they will be like, oh, hey, can I use my fingers? No, you cannot. And let me give you a little, my finger smudging speech to the kids is this: there's oil in your fingers and graphite is made of grease. Those two things, when you put them together on a piece of paper, you're going to end up with dirty spots in your paper after the drawing is over that you cannot get rid of. Smudgy spots where the oils collect and they catch in the grease. And I'll say to the kids, have you ever drawn something and you've had those like dirty splotchy spots and you don't know where they came from? That's from your fingers. I mean, and they're always eating, or I'm like, guys, if you got Cheetos on your fingers, you stick them on your drawing, I'm going to have heart failure. They'd be like, oh, okay. So really, I kind of approached it from a scientific, not like that I was being a finger smudging snob, but guys, there's a better way to do this. There's a cleaner way to do this. You may not ruin your drawing. This is a negative space thing too, this highlight. I would just figure out where it starts, like line it up where it starts, and then just have them work up to it instead of erasing it out. When they're working with negative space and they're really watching where things start, like the highlight starts right here, when they're really focusing on that, they're looking so much more intently. And that's going to help them when they get into more advanced drawings and drawing from life. We did a lot of drawing from life in my class, and the negative space, hands down, the kids would tell me that was the thing that helped them the most to keep their proportions, because they can't use a grid when something's in front of them. So they have to have skills. They have to have tools. My daughter told me my YouTube videos are too long. I just don't know how to shorten them down, because I want to tell you all the stuff, but if I fast forward, I can't tell you all the stuff. There's got to be an easier way. I also have a full portrait drawing curriculum in my Thinkific. All of my workshops, the colored pencil, the skin tones, with all the classroom resources, they are available at thinkific.com. And you can watch them over and over. It's a lifetime. If you buy it, there's no, time that you have to use it. I think that's ridiculous. Although I don't know, maybe people do that for a reason, but I think if you buy something, you should have access to it forever. If you think, I have a whole portrait drawing one, I have colored pencil, I have teaching beginning drawing, all of those things are available on that Thinkific site. And of course, it's Mrs. T. Fox Resources at Thinkific. So, check it out. I don't know if I do know one thing. A lot of districts are giving CEUs when their teachers use my workshops. So that might just be something to ask your admin about, because had a lot of people. I've even had schools order them with the PO. You don't have to sit through that agonizing data PD anymore. You can go back to your room and get your coffee and listen to me ramble on about drawing teeth. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you're interested in checking out any of my resources, at the top of the channel page in the right-hand corner of the banner, you will see a link that says Mrs. T. Fox Resources TPT Shop. Just click on that and go check it out. And please remember to subscribe to my email list at mrstfoxresources.com. Follow my Pinterest, Mrs. T. Fox Resources, and like my Facebook page at Mrs. T. Fox Resources Art Curriculum. Please don't forget to like this video, share this video, and subscribe to my channel because there's more content on the way.